Morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on socio-ecological challenges and how to equitably manage them. I'm Rachel Seary. I'm a researcher at NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center in California. I'll be running this session today with the help of Iman Rahman from the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. We have 12 fantastic speakers lined up today, and we'll be starting with our invited speaker, Professor Samiya Selim. Samiya Selim comes from the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh, where she's the director of the Center for Sustainable Development. She's also doing a part-time postdoc at ZMT Leibniz Center for Marine Tropical Research, and she's going to talk to us today about transdisciplinary and participatory approaches, that's a mouthful, to challenges of climate change and sustainable development. So thank you for being here, Samiya. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today on the last day of the Eco5 conference. You've made it thus far. It's been a really interesting 4 days, and part of it was so that it gave me a lot to reflect on. And you know, as I share my own reflections on doing transdisciplinary research work on addressing these challenges around climate change and sustainable development in Bangladesh. That's where I'm based. It's interesting because when I sent in my topic, a mouthful, now that I look at it, I kind of wanted to make it general too, so I can bring in different stories, different works that I'm doing in Bangladesh. And then as it got closer to the time, the challenge became how to connect all this work to our session today. And so, you know, our session, as you know, it's about emerging social ecological challenges and how to equitably, how we can equitably address them. And those are the two things that I'm going to focus on two specific challenges that I'm working on, and hoping to share some of my insight on doing this in a transdisciplinary way and addressing equity at all levels. So just very briefly, I've been working in this space in Bangladesh for, well, 6.5 years now, mostly in the coastal belt. And when I say addressing vulnerability, it's been multidimensional. So I'm a marine ecologist. You know, I come in with a systems thinking, social ecological approach. But just to say with Bangladesh, it's multifaceted, such as dealing with poverty, development, the political realm, and so there's many aspects of vulnerability that that we address, and even with thinking of resilience, you know, it's many dimensions. So I've been working in this space, bringing in a lot from sustainability science, which is, you know, taking a problem and trying to draw in different disciplines, whether it's from engineering, humanities, you know, legal, and on how economics, how one actually needs to bring in different disciplines and ways of looking at a problem and then addressing it to bring about sustainability. And natural resource governance is obviously the key under which the premise I work. We're trying to find solutions that's a win-win for biodiversity and for people. So the two aspects that I'll be focusing on within the different social ecological challenges we're facing. One is because it is climate induced or climate related. So the problems, climate change, pollution, all this has been around. They're not necessarily emerging, but some of the issues around how to address rising inequality whilst looking at equity issues, looking at the fact that if we want to move towards zero neutral carbon society, the fact that we are coming from very different same grounds to work with. So things like just transition, you know, we can't be imposing the same solutions to every part of the world or every scenario. You know, so those are some of the challenges on, you know, how do you deal with redistribution of wealth? How do you deal with, you know, circular economy? How do you address, you know, justice issues? All these, I feel, are part of these challenges that are emerging, that we're talking about more now. And so that's what I'll be talking about in my projects. And the other one that I'll be discussing is my postdoc work, which is around blue growth. And we, in my team, we're looking at more from a blue justice perspective, that, yes, blue economy in its definition sounds, like a really good idea. Sustainable use of resources, looking into tapping into, oceans resources that could benefit food security and livelihoods and economic growth. But, are we looking into, are we being inclusive? Are we looking at justice issues, socio-cultural impacts? And I'm working on both these areas through, at the moment, it's two projects. One is my postdoc work, which is a global project, Belmont Forum project, No Crisis, where we look at conflicts around marine resource use. And the case study that I work on is in Bangladesh, which is around blue economy. And the second one is also another global project, which is V2V, which is addressing the transition of moving from vulnerability to viability, particularly in small-scale fisheries. And as I said, I'll be focusing on the approach of bringing in well, I don't want to use stakeholders, but yes, different groups that need to be involved in addressing them and addressing equity in both the partnerships in this research, partnerships, Global South, Global North, as well as obviously the communities that we work with. Bangladesh, it's one of the it is the seventh most vulnerable country facing the impacts of climate change, partly due to its topography, flat, low-lying delta, funnel-shaped coastline, but also, as I mentioned, high poverty, high population density, very much dependent on climate-sensitive sectors, fisheries, agriculture, and at the same time, as I mentioned, the areas I work at is in the coastal belt, so you're dealing with salinity intrusion, river erosion, frequent extreme weather, natural drivers, but as well as a lot of anthropogenic drivers from unsustainable aquaculture farming, rapid development, and such. Our No Crisis, which is negotiating ocean conflicts among rivals for sustainable and equitable solutions, it starts with the premise of, okay, if we need to manage, the goal of ocean management is to have sustainable use and fair use of these resources, but some areas we have identified we've defined them as ocean hotspots, and they could be for various reasons, the productivity in those oceans hotspots, but also the geopolitics and the nations surrounding those spaces, and different types of conflicts that have risen for various reasons. So our project is, as you can see, based quite across, but mostly the conflicts that we're addressing has been around marine protected areas and fisheries, or local fisheries rights, conservation, and then mostly, but different. As you know, each place has their own. Even it could be fisheries and MPAs, but depending on the context and the place where it's based, the conflict may be different. And in Bangladesh, on fisheries and blue economy development. And the idea of the work is to identify both we hope to be able to have a typology of conflict pathways, and how one can address, as well as conflict types. And I'll briefly talk about this. We used a mixed methods approach, which takes in from different bodies of literature. So for example, process tracing comes from political ecology, where we're trying to understand origins of conflicts. And this has really been an interesting process of not like, the place-based, but looking at history and other external causes, and bringing in the timelines of, when the problems might have arisen. And sometimes you see it's not, at the source where you're addressing. Governance mapping has been a big one. It's been very participatory. We used a 7-step process. Sorry, I didn't give the sources of the literature from where this is drawn from, but it's really to understand who's making decision around natural resource governance, what decisions that they're making, who actually gets to have a say in that. A lot on investigating the different perceptions of local users to the social ecological feedback systems, and we've been doing this through cultural consensus analysis and participatory qualitative modeling. Again, psychology, and then different, as I showed, the different university, different scholars have come together with different backgrounds to really, understand the overarching questions. And then lastly, to identify trade-offs between, bringing in values. And the last one, creative arts component, is the one that I'll be sharing the case study on. Storytelling has been a big part in the actual design of the project, and the fact that we have had local artists in each of the regions, plus one of the co-PIs is also an artist, and they played a key role in each, not in all the case studies, but in many of them, to draw out how storytelling can also be a powerful way to elicit how people conceptualize a system. And in each of the case studies, we have used a different kind of artwork and using storytelling to create, co-create knowledge around these conflicts. One thing, nobody likes to talk about conflicts. it's a very, you really, and it's not something people try to avoid conflict. So, but we need to understand, some of so we can address the situation. So in Bangladesh, on this island in Maheshkhali, that's one of my 2 sites. This island is famous for salt production. It has, forested hills and mangroves. Majority are fishers, small-scale fishers, and yeah, the rural population live and depend on coastal and marine resources here since always. So as I said, those methods we used to try, we first, went in there with several of the community members, their leaders, and tried to map out how they view, so not just like typology of how we did use provisioning, regulating all the different types of ecosystem services, but also ask them how they value it, whether it's for recreation, whether it's for health within a food group. And sometimes, for example, with the fishers or salt production, they talk more about the cohesion and social cohesion and other values within an ecosystem framework that's of value to them. So we did that. We talked to them about, laws, the rules, formal and informal rules that exist around fishing, that exist on that island. And then we got into the crux of the problem, which is the fact that Bangladesh has, the government has allocated 1/5 of the land to be used for developing lots of projects. So at the moment, we have the liquid gas terminal, the deep sea port, and in the pipeline, there's also, 68 other such projects that's going to be implemented there by 2041. And this, we did it through the process tracing method, just talking to different stakeholders and finding out what are the plans. So these are views of the community themselves. So they, the many different ones, they don't see them as separate. They call it the project. That's the term they use. And obviously they identified the issues, loss of agriculture, salt production, gardening, the small-scale fishers, even though the fishing grounds necessarily hasn't, but part of the water surrounding the island has been blocked off for them, so they have to go around, more fuel use, so, a lot of indirect impacts on their livelihoods. They're saying fish have moved, but again, we don't have evidence per se of, these impacts as of now. I mean, all this is quite recent. What has happened in this middle here, this was all access to the sea. One could just see. And then, like, overnight, this community in 2 weeks' time, we were given notice to come, given some composition. These houses were built for them, and then this plant was built. And so their access to the beach and sea has been cut off. And they also say things like outsiders, they were promised jobs at these factories. They were promised skills training, but because they weren't promised skills training, they were promised jobs, but they don't have the skills to work to change that livelihood. So yes, they were promised, but they can't get the jobs. So part of the job, part of the process should have been that, you have skills training so not to say that development shouldn't have happened, but how can it have been more inclusive? How can it have been more beneficial to the local communities as well? And then we went to the nearby other fishing villages, and they also talked about the dredging for the construction of the factories. That has also impacted and made the erosion worse as well. We went and we did a workshop with a group of women, those who are living in those housing now in front of the plant, who have been displaced, and they had, they have been displaced. They used to have, they didn't have much, they had the same amount of space per se where they were, but they did some homestead gardening. They don't work outside the house, but as you can see, they talked about the noise from the terminal. They talked about if they had a say in it, they wouldn't have relocated, and they were never consulted. So that's fine to hear about the issues, the problems they face, but then, I think part of, any kind of research or the work, that I do, what can be done about it, right? So what we did was we did this workshop using stitching and storytelling with local artists there, and we asked them, okay, this has happened, we heard this, what do you want to do now? Like, what do you think will help you? And, again, through conversations, through the workshop, these are some of the key themes that came out, what they wanted. So yes, empowerment, knowledge exchange, community building, but skill sharing. They also wanted to develop more skills so they can be empowered and take part in decision making. So what we did was we did this, as I said, this workshop with 20 women over 5 days, and we used stitching to tell their stories of what they lost, their dreams, what they want to do, and also community building. All these women didn't necessarily know each other. Some of them did, but many didn't. Some knew how to stitch, others didn't. So there was a lot of skills sharing as well. I'm not going to go into the actual process, but again, this was all very new to me. That's really what I want to highlight, the fact that it was outside my, I was in my comfort zone, but like the methods or the process is not very familiar to me. But then, you trust in the artists who you've been talking to, as well as the other scientists who are involved in the project, and together, what did we want to know out of it, how they did it. They do lines and memories and colors, and they really, brought out these stories in, I would say, in a way even more, it was more personal, more connecting, and they really shared these stories. And then they, made these quilts, and we had a workshop in Dhaka where we brought in, not as many policymakers as we would have wanted to, but we invited lots of people to share their stories of displacement and what they wanted to do. So we did this in this city. And then what's been exciting is after that there was another festival wanted to showcase this work. We did, and now in Tokyo, Japan, because one of the investors in this terminal has been the lot of Japanese national corporations, and they don't necessarily know this story. So they've asked for this exhibition now. It's going to happen in Japan at the University of Tokyo there, and we're hoping, through, it's been a very organic process. None of this was part of the research project per se, but it kind of opened up. If we kept those avenues open, how else can we, take our research findings and try and, have impact? Then, that's really how we did this particular journey. And obviously, we're also our papers are coming out as well from this and the other case studies, and kind of cross comparison. And that's all another project on what do we understand on conflicts. But this is really the story from this project that I wanted to share. The other piece of work, large amount of work, is on small-scale fisheries. Again, a big, important sector for Bangladesh. 90%, as you know, small-scale fisheries employ 90% of the world's capture fisheries, provides food security and livelihoods. And in Bangladesh, it plays a crucial role, part-time employment for 1.2 million people, 60% of our protein, and contributes to the GDP. However, continue to remain marginalized and vulnerable to various shocks. So again, the work that I do here, I'm working with the Danish Institute of Human Rights, and then, with these local NGOs who are not at all in my, they don't necessarily understand about the fishery itself, or fish stocks or conservation, but they're interested in the rights of these fishers. But then they wanted us to find out, use a more academic is the word they use, but yeah, the better understanding of how they can bring these issues into their work on rights, right? So yeah, we went in and we talked to 1,000 fishermen. Again, this was during COVID, so what really helped was having these people on the ground. And so, so for these fishermen to talk to us over the phone, so it was only possible because of the work with them, right? So we did that. And then we published, we have a better understanding on resilience, so we used a 5C4R, so 5 capitals, looking at the assets fishermen have and different properties of resilience. And then we looked at multi-level levels of resilience, so we have a better understanding. And that has fed into the other project that I'm involved in, which is the V2V, to understand, what are some of these vulnerabilities and strengths, and how do they perceive viability, right? It's not just us coming down on them and then taking these strategies of, how can we transition from vulnerability to viability. And the key thing was on building on what we know and have learned already. And one of again, this project allowed us not to start from scratch again, not to say, because those papers weren't published when the project started, but it could build on what we already did with these other stakeholders and bring them into the project as well. And these are, right now the six areas with that we are pursuing, not only obviously in our research, but working with, for example, the government on fisher ID cards for the fishermen, so they can access support during the fish bans. Right now, they don't really have, they get a particular type of support, but what they want is flexible support, whether it be cash, or they can choose what to do with it. So, we're trying to change, okay, social protection right now allows this, 40 kg of rice and something else, but, maybe it needs more flexibility. Access to credit, that's a big one, because they end up taking loans from loan sharks and other sources, and that gets them more into debt. Improving the value chain and profit distribution, that's been a big one. Again, we're having to work with economists and people who understand finance and businesses, a lot more than I do. So it's kind of that recognition of, you need to be working with other people to address these issues. And obviously recognition of women, which is another issue in Bangladesh. And lastly, I wanted to finish up with this paper that I did with 2 other co-authors around, we asked, I forget the number, a number of marine managers, marine protected area managers, fisheries managers, on, who are always, and the fishers always being asked, what, we wanted to do transdisciplinary research, but sometimes, we tend to think of the questions beforehand in our labs, in our, little academic bubbles, but, and so we asked them, how they think, what has worked on the ground for them in such projects. And these were 4 insights that we need to build in time to build rapport with communities. We need to be comfortable being in a messy situation, coming from diverse, sources of knowledge. It's not one way. We need to be careful of data extraction and, promising when we don't go back to the communities again after we collect our data. And they give examples of where this has worked. It's not just like, okay, that's great if you do this, when it has worked and what it has led to. So that's the, and we keep on trying to follow some of these in our current work and work going forward. And yeah, I think just about, 5 minutes into my question and answer sessions. So thank you, and thank you for listening.
Does anyone have any questions for Samiya? Well, I'll be selfish and ask my questions then. I wanted to know a bit more about this 65-day fishing ban. What caused it, and what were the implications of that?
So the fishing ban is it's during the Hilsha, so we have, Hilsha is our main fishery, and this is for the conservation of the Hilsha fisheries. So there's this blanket ban during the spawning time, so there's 2 months and then again another period. But what happened, again, the process of, when it started, it's blanket across the coast where, they don't really take into consideration the scientific knowledge around where the grounds are or, which fishers are actually involved in Hilsha fisheries applies to fishermen across. So that itself is an issue. And the fact that, yes, they get support during the ban, but you have to have a fisher ID card to access that support. And what happens in these boats that the fishers go out, one person has and the others are helpers, even though they are also fisher. So they don't necessarily get to access the help of the government. And even the help they get, they're like, if they could invest that in something else, rather than just the rice and the, the food items they get, that would be better for them so they don't go further into more, financial debt during that ban. What happened during the time we did that study, lockdown happened for 2 months, March to May, and then the ban started. So they had like 4 months of not being able to fish. So it really was like a double shock of like, sudden shock of COVID plus the ban has only been around for, I forget how many years now, it's not that long, less than 5 years. So it's, that itself is also something they're adjusting to. And for the most part, they're happy, they understand the need for it, but they just want the management of it, to be, looked into.
Thank you. Does anyone else have questions? Lots of questions now.
Thank you, Samiya. That was a great presentation. Just on one slide about the impacts of a project, so that kind of, reminds me that when we talk about climate change, we tend to forget everything else, but climate change impacts are a small subset of the many other drivers and their impacts, which needs attention and which clearly comes out of your presentation. But we tend to kind of, overshadow all the impacts of all those different, more pervasive drivers in our discussions of climate change, So I just thought that I would make that, clear here. Any reflections from you would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, even when I get emerging challenges, yes, climate change, looming, but, let's not also, the inequality and there's so many other issues besides. Climate change is kind of making a lot of it worse, but, the fact that resources are so, there is unfair distribution of how resources are consumed and produced, and so then I gave the example of the just transition, which is around climate change, but it also highlights the fact that why is there a need for, some countries to do that transition in a different way than others. And so making that explicit, brings out these other issues as well. And obviously there's the other drivers of, capitalism and, there's all kinds of drivers there. But climate change just kind of, makes all of that a bit worse.
Thank you, Samiya. Congratulations for the great work. I was wondering if you heard back from the government. Is there any feedback or any promise for the future? And is there any ecosystem-based management, including these types of conflicts in the fishery in general?
So there is, from the government, their marine special planning is being discussed and done. There is work around the fisheries, not so much on the blue economy development space. It's still very rosy and golden, and it's a good thing. We have these untapped marine resources, and we need to tap into it, and it'll provide jobs and economic growth for the country. And so that narrative is still there. I don't think anybody at the local level, sure, but not at the national. But with fisheries, yes, I think the government is in taking that into consideration. There's ecosystem-based management, marine special planning, marine protected areas. There's a lot of work happening.
Thank you.
I think We now need to move on to the next speaker, but I think Samiya is going to stick around all day, so ask all your questions to her during the break. Thank you, Samiya.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Marianna Cavallo, who's going to talk about fisheries vulnerability in French Polynesia.
Thank you. So French Polynesia is one of the small Pacific island states that you can see in this map. So yeah, we can see them because they're actually small pieces of land in the huge Pacific Ocean. As you can see in this other map, they actually exist, and even if they land, the proportion of land they have is small, they have a huge marine area. So the livelihood of those community and the lives are strictly connected with the ocean, the ocean resources and the services they provide. So these communities are considered among the most vulnerable to climate change, and they are also the least responsible for those changes. So when I developed this project, initially I wanted to use the incredible knowledge about the ocean resources and the ocean, the way they observe the ocean to integrate into my vulnerability assessment. And then when I was discussing with them about the sensitivity of those communities to climate change, there was an issue that came out that I didn't consider before. And this is the challenges that I want to discuss, the emerging challenges that I want to discuss with you today. So the ciguatera fish poisoning is basically it's a toxic microalgae which contaminate reef species, which are the main food sources of these communities. So these communities are impacted by the cumulative impact of climate change and the expected increase of ciguatera fish poisoning in the future. So before to show you the link between climate change and ciguatera fish poisoning, I want to show you why ciguatera is a really it's a complex issue. So it is caused by the ingestion of contaminated marine seafood by Gambierdiscus, so it's a dinoflagellate which contaminates all the reef species of which this community is really dependent on. As you can see, this map shows you the wide distribution of the 23 species of Gambierdiscus across the globe. As you can see, the distribution is huge, and it's an endemic issue of all the tropic area. It's a complex issue because today there is no difference for a fisher or a consumer to distinguish poisoned or not poisoned food by the odor they expect on the behavior of fish. The toxin is not altered by any form of food preparation, so basically there is no way to kill the toxin or to deactivate the toxin. And the detection laboratory tests exist, but they are actually expensive. They require skilled staff, and they cannot be applied in a large scale. So we cannot use this detection test to check if all the catches are poisoned or not. And then potentially all reef species can be infected by ciguatera. So there have been identified more than 400 reef species, which are both fish and shellfish. Also, ciguatera is not site-specific, which means that they can contaminate all reef. And in the same atoll or in the same island, you can have contaminated and not contaminated area a few kilometer distance. So French Polynesia is an hotspot of Gambier discus, and it presented most of the 23 species of this ciguatera, among the most toxic ones. So they have learned through centuries to manage this issue with traditional knowledge, and the information flows through the generation in generation. Just to give you an example, in the same, you can ask fishers, but fishers and local consumer knows which are the contaminated area in the island. And even in the contaminated area, there can be some fish species that are not toxic. So let's go back to the link between ciguatera fish poisoning and climate change. So ciguatera is caused by ciguatera distribution and abundance is favored by any form of human activity or climate change effect that cause the alteration of the reef ecosystems. So for the purpose of this conference, I want to focus on the climate drivers. How climate change will have an impact on ciguatera? We have two main impacts. We expect an increase of frequency, abundance, and toxicity of ciguatera fish poisoning in endemic area, so all the Pacific, for example, and then climate change is creating the suitable condition for the Gambier discus to develop in area where this species is not endemic, for example, in the Mediterranean Sea, and people don't know how to recognize it, how to cure, etc. So the consequences of, in the economic and the social context are those that are usually related with the harmful algal blooms. So the impact on small-scale fishery, for example, or the social impact on the health, on food security and food safety, for example. So I have two main research questions that I want to discuss with you today. So it's the ability, how the ability of the Pacific communities where this illness is endemic will be affected, their ability and the strategy they developed through centuries will be affected in the future climatic conditions. And then how ciguatera fish poisoning will impact the communities and the fishers in the areas where this illness is not endemic. And there are growing pieces of literature that are trying to identify this issue and the impact. So the problem is that ciguatera fish poisoning in the Pacific area in general, or in the endemic area, has an impact mostly on the reef fisheries. So it's subsistence fisheries or recreational fisheries, for which we don't have any data on the catches, on the type of fish, on the gear, etc. So basically, I didn't know where to start to assess the vulnerability of those communities. The other one is that even if there are growing studies on the toxicity, for example, the Gambier discus, we don't know, there not exist any vulnerability assessment which include the sensitivity and adaptive capacity, which are specific for ciguatera fish poisoning. So to do this, I adapted the existing, the vulnerability index or the vulnerability framework for the climate change and the existing vulnerability index for other harmful algal blooms. And I want to discuss with you today, I want to show you today what I've done to see if I'm going in the right direction. So the last is that we estimate that only 20% of the cases of ciguatera fish poisoning is actually reported. So we have a huge gap in declaration. So we don't know the symptoms, we don't know which species, we don't know the toxicity of each species of Gambier discus and so on. So to do this, I had to integrate local knowledge and local observation to fill the gaps in the literature, and so to create a suitable list of indicators of vulnerability. So this is the framework that I created, and I adapted to the seawater fish poisoning. I had the chance to discuss with some of you, especially the first day that you presented some vulnerability assessment impact to adjust this framework. So first, the exposure criteria. So we know there are several effects of climate change that will have an impact on the Gambier discus distribution, but also creating conditions for the most toxic species of Gambier discus to install in new areas. The other impact is the temperature especially has an effect on the metabolism of fish, so on their ability to biomanify and to detoxify the Gambier discus. And finally, these effects will have an impact on the reef ecosystem, so creating the conditions for Gambier discus to grow in these areas when the coral reef is replaced by macroalgae, which are the favorite substrate of Gambier discus. So the first step is to make the literature review of all those climate drivers that can create the suitable conditions for Gambier discus to develop. The second step was to go to French Polynesia and to integrate, to develop specific survey for local experts, especially in the Institute Louis Malardé, which is one of the most prominent institutes studying seawater fish poisoning for 30 years in the Pacific. And then I integrated those data on the seawater fish poisoning, so epidemiological data with the information about the oceanographic data. So I asked them to see the link or the trend between seawater fish poisoning and the changes in climatic condition at local scale. So the sensitivity. I didn't find a proper, many studies that have investigated the effects of climate change in the social ecological system. So I took as example, as reference the paper which are focused on the indicators of harmful algal blooms in general. So I integrated those indicators, socio-economic vulnerability, into the specific questionnaire and surveys that I submitted to the local experts, especially human scientists. And then I tested with local fishers and local community to see how they will be impacted by these changes. Some impact are more evident, for example, in the health of the consumer or impact in the fishery activity, but others are less evident. For example, the change in the culture or in the social link, which are mostly based on the fishing activity, on traditional fishery. And these are just the adaptive capacity. Again, I couldn't find any adaptive capacity indicator specific for Ciguatera, so the literature review was based on the identified factors, criteria of adaptive capacity. Okay, I'm finished. So again, I submitted this list of criteria to local experts, and then I tested at the local scale with fishers to ask them, what will you do to adapt to the future increase of abundance and distribution of Ciguatera fish poisoning? So I'm currently analyzing the responses of the interviews, which is not easy because there is qualitative information for local knowledge and quantitative information for local expert and literature review. I'm preparing a second field work to give the result, to present the result to the local expert and to fishery communities. So hopefully I will be able to reply to my to research question to see how the seawater fish poisoning will affect local indigenous community and new communities in the future with the future climatic condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianna. Our next speaker is Lilly Baumann, who's going to talk about sustainability transformations in New Caledonia.
I'm Lilly, and I'm currently a bachelor student at the Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany. And I had the chance to do an internship at the IRD, the National Research Institute of France for Sustainable Development in Nouméa in New Caledonia. And together with my peer student, Marianne Braun, we were able to design and also conduct our own small research project, which I will show you the results of, like some of the results of now. And we called this Interventions Towards Sustainability Transformations in Coastal Social Ecological Systems in Uvea, New Caledonia. And this was part of the Pecl project, and we got always help from our supervisors, Alexandre and also Mariah Richers. So now I'm just explaining you quickly the methods. As you probably know, the South Pacific region is facing severe sustainability challenges like climate change and its effects, but also destructive human practices like pollution or overfishing. And to lead to more sustainable pathways, we would need a system transformation towards a more sustainable state, which could be induced by well-placed interventions, which are deliberate human actions that can improve the current state towards a more sustainable state. And the goal was then to find out some of these interventions and to also analyze their potential for transformation. And our research question was then, to what extent do sustainability interventions in the South Pacific show transformational potential towards a sustainable future? And we approached this question in 2 steps. So first we used the data from a systematic literature review done by our supervisor and a peer student, and looked for the different interventions that were being proposed in the scientific literature. And later we tried to group them into certain intervention groups and also into so-called leverage points, which are points in a system where if you implement an intervention there, this can lead to a big change in the system. And yes, so we took these groups of interventions, or these leverage points, then to design qualitative expert interviews, where we talked with different experts from local, regional, and provincial, and also the overall South Pacific regional scale. And we wanted to ask them how they perceive these how they perceive the transformation potential of the interventions that got proposed in the scientific literature. And yes, so we all did this in a case study, which was in Uvea, which is a small low-lying atoll island northeast of the coast of New Caledonia, like the mainland of New Caledonia, which you can see there on the map. And we chose this place, like Uvea, because it faces lots of sustainability challenges that are also faced by many other similar challenges are also faced by many other places in local social ecological systems in the South Pacific region. And over the time in Uvea, we conducted 10 interviews with 13 different people from diverse professional backgrounds, for example, a representation from the government and municipalities, but also from environmental organizations, social organizations. We also talked to the cultural authorities and people who worked in the fishing and tourism sector. And afterwards, we also had additional interviews with people from regional organizations like USP, SPC, and SPREP. And yes, so during these interviews, we then asked the participants how they perceive this transformational potential of the interventions mentioned in the scientific literature. And yes, to get to know the socio-ecological system in Uvea a little bit better, in Uvea, the livelihoods of the Kanak people, which are the indigenous people in New Caledonia, they are very tightly connected to their surrounding ecosystem and, of course, the ocean, because it's a small island. And but the island is also, or the system is also facing many sustainability challenges. For example, invasive species like the coconut beetle that is threatening their palm trees, but also the loss of cultural practices and knowledge. And also coastal erosion is threatening their villages, the infrastructure, and also cultural sites. Also, additionally, the effects of climate change, like warming of the surface temperature, and also the increase of extreme events. This is also threatening their systems, especially when it comes to fishing, for example, or to the production of and growing of vegetables, which are also very important for the culture. And in this whole system, also there's limited financial capacity, so often to face these challenges, they are very, sorry, I'm too excited. No, they need the help from outside, for example, from the mainland or from France, which is, yeah, the overseas territory. So now I'm just going to show you some of our results from our main exercise within the interviews. And yeah, I'm just trying to explain you this figure. So on the x-axis, you can see the leverage points that we chose, which we found most relevant for this social-ecological system, Uvea. And it's just a short version of them. But so you can find them on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you can find the transformational potential as perceived by the interviewees, from high to low change potential or transformation potential. And the size of the bubbles just says how many people did that, so it's just quantitatively how the interviews put these different interventions and leverage points and on which, like, where on the scale they put them. So I will just give some quick examples of this. As you can see, the integration of the participation and also the integration of indigenous people and local communities knowledge was put quite high, like it was put quite high in the transformation potential. So people really stressed that it's very important to include local communities and their knowledge into all processes regarding to coastal management or also fisheries. And then, for example, another point or leverage point, which was put quite high in the transformation potential, was the institutionalized environmental and climate change education, which you can see here. And yes, so this education part was also perceived as very important for conducting participatory research, for example, so that the participants already know about certain problems. And yes, so then, as you can see, there was also other points, for example, relocation, which was like participants weren't really sure about where to put it on the scale. So some said that it's quite important or has a quite high transformation potential because you're actually putting people into a completely new system, and that the coast of Uvea is already threatened by coastal erosion, so there might be the need to relocate in the future, not right now. Others said that if other interventions would be successful, there's no need for relocation. So they put it a little bit lower on the transformational potential scale. And another example, for example, is here infrastructure, which was, we wanted to talk about coastal protection, which often ended in a discussion about seawalls, because which also is why lots of the interviews put this very low on the scales, because lots of the participants told us that there has been seawalls which were built, and this actually led to maladaptation and accelerating problems in this area. So they asked for more nature-based solutions, for example. And yes, so this was some examples. I think I'm a little bit... this is then the leverage points framework we were working with from the beginning, after Meadows and Epson et al. And it just says that, for example, there are parameters which are system characteristics that are quite easy to change and also often targeted by policymakers. But they won't change the overall system if you implement them. And there's, for example, we sorted in financial compensation in there, or also relocation. But there's also on the right side of this figure, for example, the intent, like the overall goal of a system, or the values and worldviews of the people within the system. So if you would be able to change this, for example, with increasing participation and also including local and indigenous knowledge and practices, then you could actually change the system towards a more sustainable state. Like, this is kind of the theory behind it, just to give a... So for the conclusion and outlook, we found it very interesting to look from the leverage points perspective on this very complex social ecological system in Uvea, and also, but there has to be more research, and it has to be studied further how these interventions also can be put in place, because often we talked about deep leverage points even, but they weren't implemented, and also the interviews had a hard time explaining like how we could actually implement them. And so especially if there are interventions made, they definitely need to be adapted to the local context, and it should be put special emphasis on participatory management and also research approaches, and local and indigenous knowledge should always be included into this research. Otherwise it could lead to maladaptation, like for example with the seawalls I talked about earlier. And but all these leverage points, of course, they don't exist in isolation from each other, but they are very connected, so they can have effects on another if they are put in place. And yes, so all in all, we can say that complex sustainability challenges and social ecological system also demand for inter- and transdisciplinary perspectives. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question for Lilly? Thanks, Robert.
So for your main figure, you basically had an index of perceived success of each leverage point, but you did have some sort of qualifiers on each of those. do you think it would be helpful to integrate sort of like an uncertainty for each of those responses, basically to be able to track things that are like related to contingency since they don't seem to be acting independently, it's hard for the responses to provide their input. I'm trying to say this correctly. It sounded like they had a hard time responding to your questions without sort of equivocating based on other leverage points or uncertainty about how it might work or how successful it might be. So do you think there's room to improve this method that way?
I don't really know if I understood the question right. Like, we had these leverage points from the literature review, and then we asked them to place them into a certain like range from high to low change potential, but
it sounded like maybe they had a little difficulty doing that because of uncertainty, understanding what those leverage impacts were, or because they were contingent on other activities at the same time. So maybe there's a way to improve.
Yes, probably there's a way to improve because like it's very, very complex issues, and also we were talking about so many different things at the same time. So we were already trying to get it down to only 10 leverage points we were talking with them about. But then we were trying to explain them to them as good as possible within the interviews. And like they always had to say something about it because, so I think it worked quite well, even though we got like different responses and different focus points in the different interviews. Yeah. But also this is just the first data. We still have to analyze it much more and also compare it to the literature review analysis, for example. But I don't know if this answered your question.
Yeah, that helped. Thank you for the insight.
Sounds like there's a lot to talk about over coffee. Thank you, Lilly.
Thank you.
So we'll take a break now and we'll be back at 11. Welcome back, everyone. We're starting out with Felipe Quezada, who's actually pre-recorded his talk online. So you'll be able to ask your questions to him afterwards on the app if you'd like to. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Felipe Quezada, and I'm part of Santa Cruz and NOAA Fisheries. And today I'm going to present this paper, which is part of the CAFA project that looked at the impact of climate change on forage species in the United States West Coast. And particularly this paper tried to understand how market availability and closure affect different responses of the CPS fleet in the United States. Okay? So one of the things we know is that climate change will affect species availability through two things: to changing in fishing ground, where the fish is going to be in the future, right? And also in the abandon of the fish, right? So one of the things this paper wants to understand is how will change species distribution, right, and regulation that emerge from climate change, right, will affect landing in the United States CPS fishery. Okay. In this paper, I estimate 3 landing modes for the squid, market squid, for North anchovy and Pacific sardine. All these are forage species for the United West Coast, and these one are interrelated through species availability, right? But also through regulation. And the data I have is daily vessel level landing data by port from 2000 to 2020. This data includes revenue, prices at the port, the length of the vessel, the species that they caught during the day, right? And obviously the ID. So to estimate the model, I obtained the monthly average by port area and vessel. The empirical model consists of a dependent variable, which is the log of landings. Then I get a positive outcome. And also consists of explanatory variables, such as species availability captured by the SDM output from a species distribution model, other species availability, right, multiplied by the species consideration availability, species prices, and vessel length, which try to capture like the capacity a vessel has in terms of fishing effort. Okay, so the equation for landing is here. This just tell you like the total landing depend on all the variables I have told you before. Also include closure in case of market squid and anchovy to try to understand what happened when the closure of the Pacific sardine started. The species distribution model output, the species availability, are linked to the landing model through each port. First, I try to see which is the fishing ground to see how far a vessel travels, and then I compute radius from each port depending on the species, and then I get the average within each radius through a month of what is the species availability. To capture heterogeneity, I'm not going to show you the methodology, but I ran a cluster analysis to try to group each vessel in a fleet segment. And then, after doing this analysis, I label each cluster depending on their input. For example, how much they travel, which are the main area they land, Southern California, Pacific Northwest, or what is the percentage of the revenue that comes from CPS, or how much income they do to try to see if they are small scale or industrial, right? And then using the graph I have here on the left, also I label them if they are like squid specialists, like this first cluster or this fourth cluster here, right? Or they are generalists, like in this cluster they do squid and sardine, or they're really diverse, like in this cluster they do a lot of CPS, right? And again, using this result, then I can estimate if the unit coefficient dependent on the fleet segment a vessel it belongs to. Depending on the model I'm estimating, depending on the species I'm estimating a model, right? I'm going to use different port areas and different fleet segments, and the main criteria to decide which one are in each model is just how much availability I have of data. Okay, so for example, for squid, so market squid model, I use vessels who are in California, right? And mostly are these from fleet segment that are squid specialists, but also have some generalists here, as well as some forage fish diverse cluster. And now let's go to the result. Let's first see what happened with the price. So one of the main results I obtained, one of the main general results is that squid are really market dependent. So they are really affected by price, particularly by price. So if you observe higher price for the species, you observe higher landing of squid. So kind of makes like telling you that they are like a more segmented market for this. For sardine and anchovy, we don't see too much of this strong effect of prices. Just in few port areas and segments this happen. Regarding the SDN output or approximate species availability, the only species that is positively and significantly affected by availability is sardine. One interesting result, what happened after the Pacific sardine closure. We know that this is not a causal effect, but they're more like correlative effect. So one thing is we will expect that there are switching to squid landing in California, but we can observe in cluster 1 there's a decrease in catch composition in this fleet, and also that happened also in the cluster 4, which also from Southern California. And an interesting thing is like a fleet that are part of Pacific Northwest, you see like they start to harvest a little squid after the closure. And this is mostly because we know that sardines have been moving north. So that happened here. And they start to fish squid as a new species in this cluster. Another thing that happened here is that after setting closer, they try to move to other highly valued species like crabs, for example, here or here. These are, again, from the Pacific Northwest. Okay, let's see now what happened with the statistical model. This one is a little better than the previous analysis, as here we are controlling for other factors. And now the conclusion not that clear for squid. We observed like there a decrease in landing per vessel in Santa Barbara and Los Angeles for the industrial fleet. But there's an increase in landing per vessel in LA for the small-scale fleet. In terms of anchovy, here's a little more clear picture. There's a decrease in landing in Southern California, but we see an increase in landing per vessel after the closure of sardine in the Pacific Northwest. So one of the main conclusions of this research is vessel heterogeneity and landing port are really important to explain vessel response to species availability and other variables. However, we have some major generalization that we can observe. First, sardine availability is mostly determining sardine landing per vessel. In the case of squid, the results, the landing per vessel, are mainly driven by market condition and do not respond to changes with SDM at the sardine. And in contrast of these other two species, landing per vessel are actually not correlated with the SDM or the prices. And I haven't shown the result here because I didn't have time, but they are mostly driving what happened with the Pacific sardine. So another conclusion is that the strong relationship that we found for sardine between availability and per vessel landing cannot be generalized to squid and anchovy. This is really important because there are some studies that try to connect abundance of a species to landings. However, we have to consider other variables that can be affecting this relationship, right? Can be decoupling availability to landing. For example, prices and regulation that are in place. Finally, some of the main conclusion is that they're not universal truths that can be applied across fisheries. Okay, so some that there is generalization, some heterogeneous driver of landing, right, for the high volume CPS segment and port. However, for mid and low volume CPS fleet, the motivation of and drivers of landing are quite less clear, and we cannot see any pattern here. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much to the conference to send my paper to be presented here in this session. And bye.
I believe that Felipe is actually following the session online from California, so I encourage you to send lots of messages and questions to him via the app. Next up, we have Jay Peterson, who's going to talk about the Resist, Adapt, Direct framework.
Thank you. First point, the information that's presented here is in a publication that was released early last year in the Journal of Fisheries Management and Ecology. And so if there's ideas in here that intrigue you and want to learn more about, there's the paper to look at. And then also I highlighted the two people here, myself and Kathy Mills, that are at the meeting. So I guess in the next 3 hours, if you have questions, you can find us as well. This was a collaborative effort, a nice range of folks from a diverse variety of governmental and academic institutions in the U.S. that were interested in fisheries management. What doesn't come out here is that many of these are looking at freshwater systems as well as marine. So about half the authors are interested in freshwater, half in marine. What I'll talk about here is a marine base, but if there's interest in freshwater, these principles apply there as well. So this group had gotten together a couple of years ago with a broader group that was addressing an emerging issue in resource management, that's ecosystem transformation. So that's systems changing from what's currently an established system, moving to something novel and unprecedented, and that causes big issues for management. So as a group, working group getting together to think about what are ways to approach that transforming ecosystem and how it can be managed. And it was led as from, I think, a terrestrial perspective. The National Park Service that was looking at terrestrial systems and seeing the example here is a spruce forest that with warming temperatures and drier conditions are susceptible to beetle death and forest fire, and that's transforming a forest into a grassland. And then there's, of course, marine examples. I should have gone with a kelp forest into an urchin barren, but coral reefs that are becoming dominated by algal cover, and an example that's come up in many talks on the Gulf of Alaska that with a regime shift in the 70s, that fishery moved from shrimp based in the 70s to more groundfish in the end. So it's these ecosystems are transforming into and providing services that are different than they had in the past. And so one of the purposes of the group, or one of the activities when this group got together, was to look at what is the range of options or approaches you could take to managing a system, and develop this RAD framework, and also worked with a graphic artist to put it into a nice visual here. It wasn't Boss, that Kohler, that's been the ICES one, but this nice graphic in the end kind of helps display that if you're in a system, and in here it'd be a sailboat, it's out at sea, and the prevailing winds of change are blowing that boat away from its port, familiar port, there's what are the options it can do? And there can be a resist strategy to want to get back to those conditions you were in before. And in some cases, the farther you are away from the conditions, maybe it takes a lot more effort and work to get back to those conditions. Also, there's the accept strategy that may either be on purpose or not knowingly. So if you don't have the mechanisms or the resources to be able to work to get back to the conditions, maybe you just accept where change is taking you. And then with the sailboat here, whether it ends up in a nice, pleasant beach area versus rocky, you just don't know what the future is. And the last strategy that's been getting a little more consideration, at least in terrestrial systems, and possibly marine, is to be able to, can you direct the system? Can you foresee some conditions that may be resilient under climate and get there? Like in this case, the sailboat, can you set your sail and chart ahead to some conditions that may be more resilient to future climate? And so in the paper, we put that into the fisheries management context, that socio-ecological perspective, where you have strategies or goals, maybe ecological goals as well as social goals, and you can use that resist, accept, direct framework within those. And so we're looking at the considerations that go into which ones could be used in the system. And so which approaches you could use are dependent on how controllable those aspects are. So on the y-axis, we looked at ecological responsiveness on the low end. So can you do actions that will change, that the environment will react to and change? And societal receptivity to change. Is the social system set on that one resource they've had, or is there some flexibility in there? And so if you lay that resist, accept, direct on there, you come up with these, well, we put them into quadrants just for easier explanation, but it's supposed to be a continuous gradient there. But we'll step through the different quadrants in here. So on that lower left, that's low ecological responsiveness and low societal receptivity. It's really the most limiting of the situations. You accept change as it happens, and there tends to be, say, social resist. You want to maintain that resource that you've been accustomed to. And so in terms of things that can be done, you're probably looking at engaging with stakeholders and trying to minimize the take on that resource. So whether you can reduce bycatch on that resource, or if it's a commercial fishery and a recreational, would the recreational fishery go to catch and release and allow more for the system. As you move up that ecological responsiveness, now you're into the zone where you could have any ecological response. You could hopefully be able to resist or accept or direct, and the social aspect of it is most likely pushing you towards the resist. So you put in efforts to improve habitat, to maintain the fishery, or possibly augment, like some salmon fisheries in the northwest of the U.S., they're augmenting with hatchery volumes to augment the catch fishery. And again, on the social side, you're on the stakeholder engagement side, and then there'll still be some considerations there. As you move down to lower right, you're back to low responsiveness ecologically, but it opens up a lot more social strategies to be able to consider whether you be open to promoting new fisheries opportunities, to new species that are migrating into the system, possibly aquaculture, and also whether you could diversify career opportunities there. And then upper corner is the one that the most options are open, and the best potential to direct change, and possibly work toward a system that's resilient to these conditions. And so I think if you look at your system that you're in, the ecosystem, and it falls at a certain place in this matrix, that's not the spot where it needs to be. Like, things can change over time. So you may be able to improve ecological responsiveness through improved knowledge of that system, better monitoring, understanding mechanisms that are controlling it, and maybe there's techniques such as maybe favorable genotypes. So if I think there's examples off Florida with reefs where they're favoring a genotype that is more resilient to warming conditions, and whether those could be possibly used in new areas to get to or direct to a new habitat. On the social side, the receptivity to changes can change over time. Right? It might be short term if consequences are imminent, but over time, as impacts continue to be felt, there's maybe a change in receptivity to how that system is managed. And again, in both, the size of the region is an important component. That controllability of ecosystems, thinking of marine systems and pelagic, are big. To be able to think that it can be controlled is may not be realistic, but if you're looking at some smaller areas that are more contained, then you have more options there. And similar on the social side, that size and region, number of stakeholders can be a constraint in terms of fewer stakeholders, maybe better to come to a consensus as opposed to more, but it can go both ways. And then this is not in the paper itself, but as we've heard about in many of the talks along here, there's probably a third axis to this on governance, is how, and I guess you need an R adjective, how ready is governance to be able to accept these changes and allow them to happen in the system. So another axis to be looking at in the future. But overall, the purpose of that framework or developing that was just to provide those options, and especially like on the direct side of things, a lot of people are looking at resisting or accepting change, but not as much as going into directing change. So it's the power of sharing these ideas across the different disciplines as terrestrial systems and learning from what they're doing may be able to be applied here. But this matrix was putting into place that to be able to react quickly, there may be these windows of opportunity that come up as an invasive species comes in. If you react right away, that might leave your options open for being able to resist direct in the future. But if you wait, you may run out of those options. But looking at that matrix, you could understand possibly what your approaches could be, and then see if they're not a good set of options, then you could be working more towards controllability and potentially open up new ones in the end. So this is last slide. This was conceptual, and there are examples of, more examples of how this can and could be used in terrestrial systems. A few, as I said, there's a lot of freshwater systems that are nicely contained, and it's a little easier to envision how that's working. And we're still looking for examples globally on how this might be currently being used or considered in global. So I'd love to hear from folks now or later in the meeting before my voice goes out, on if there's examples you have on the resist, accept, direct approaches there. I better stop before I. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have time for a question if anyone has one for Jay.
Recently, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk. And recently I was speaking with fishermen about technological change. And often it seemed that the senior fishers who are kind of close to retirement, maybe they would, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but maybe they would more often be in the accept category, because the young people are often really interested in new technologies, you know, to reduce emissions in my case. And I was wondering if you've come across sort of a generational difference.
Yeah, and fortunately, it's not my area of expertise. I'm an ecologist more than on the social science, so understanding that. But yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I think I could see the openness to taking on the new technologies. I mean, I still think on some, I would assume that when entering a fishery, this younger generation still wants to see that reliance on the resource. And so I don't know if you get that balance of I'm in this and I'm anticipating 30 years of being able to fish and make a livelihood out of this. And so whether, I think, and so helping out, I guess, to see the acceptance of technologies to how can I help better understand the system so we can keep this moving, and maybe, yeah.
Any more questions? No? Okay, well, thank you, Jay.
Yep.
We'll move on to our next speaker, who is Padmanav Pallavi, who's going to talk about the human dimension indicators in Mumbai. Thank you.
Hi, hello. I'm Pallavi. I'm a PhD student at Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies, IIT Bombay. This is part of my PhD work. So this is human dimension indicator-based assessment of change in coastal ecosystem services delivery in Mumbai. A little complicated, I'll simplify it. So this is basically the context of the work. Well, here we have utilized a socio-ecological survey to collect the data on quality and quantity of ecological variables which are associated with the ecosystem services, as well as the human dimensions of ecosystem measures of well-being. Well, there are two schools of thoughts basically that one school of thought says that ecosystem services, the change in ecosystem services, they can be measured, valued through the market value, or they can be, those ecosystem services can be measured through their market values in the economical market. And the other school of thought is that not every ecosystem service can be measured through their economical value or through the market price. And I follow the second school of thought. So how do we measure then the change in ecosystem services? And here we have approached to measure, to see how the deliverance level of these ecosystem services has changed in my study area. So we have used the human dimension indicators of ecosystem services, and these indicators are identified, and they should be able to measure changes in provision of all ecosystem services which are affected or will affect a specific environmental characteristics that are important to the society. So here I'm emphasizing on environmental characteristics because the study area I'm focusing on right now is quite important. So I'll explain briefly. So this is the map of Mumbai. It's a city. It's one of the most densely populated cities of India. It is prone to flooding. As per IPCC report, it's one of the most vulnerable cities in the world to climate change, especially to sea level rise. By 2050, almost 30% of Mumbai will be submerged underwater. And this is my small study area, where I'm focusing majorly on small-scale or artisanal fishes. And here you can see that the northern part of my study area is known as Mahim, and the southern part of my study area is known as Worli, and they are known as Kolivadas. So Koli is the fishing community in my study area, and Kolivada means fishing village. So I'm focusing on these two fishing villages right now. And as you can see, it's around, it has a small patch of mangrove in the east. It extends actually into the city. And here you can see a small river. It's known as Methi River, and it's one of the most important rivers of Mumbai. And if you know about the 2005 flooding events of Mumbai, where lakhs and lakhs of people got affected, impacted by the flooding, it was a huge flooding event. It was caused by overflowing of Methi River. And and also these two study areas are adjacent to Mahim Bay. So the entire coast of Mumbai has its own coastal regulation policies, but since this area is adjacent to Mahim Bay, it's not considered as a coastal zone. So the coastal policies are not implied here, and the coastal policies are tweaked here to exploit these ecosystems for various economical and development purposes. And yeah, these two ecosystems, these two villages have different ecological setups, ecological entities. Worli Kolivada is mostly, or Worli coastal area is mostly a rocky beach. It has a lot of rocks. Whereas Mahim has a soft bottom beach with mangroves. And the environmental problems or environmental contestations, so also the socio-political contestations are quite different in these two areas. In Mahim, it's mostly the pollution that's coming from the Methi River, whereas for Worli, it's this bridge you can see, it's called as Bandra-Worli Sea Link, to reduce the traffic in the city, but it's constructed on the sea, which causes a lot of problem for the fisher community there. So what are the ecosystem services that I will be looking here? So as per MEA, there are 5 types of ecosystem services, and I'm focusing on these 4 ecosystem services right now. And these ecosystem services are under the pressures, are under the combined pressure of climate change and anthropogenic impacts. And the services here are production services, and I'm looking at fish and other seafood production. Regulating services, I'm looking at pollution and flood regulation. For cultural service, the aesthetic provision and leisure. And supporting services, the resilience of ecosystem from climatic and anthropogenic pressures. So these are my 22 indicators to assess the change in deliverance level of ecosystem services, and these are all human dimension indicators that has been analyzed from the perception of small-scale fisheries in my study area. These 3 for fish production, regulation, and storm regulation and pollution regulation, these are mostly the indicators specifically for my study area, and these are generic, and I've picked them from Loomis and David. And if I go back, this is the work methodology that I've followed. First, I've conducted a small pilot survey in both these Kolivadas, or fishing villages. And I've done some literature review to understand how these ecosystem service indicators or ecosystem services work there. What's the culture of the area, how the fishing villages are impacted by these pressures. Then after that, we have done, we selected an ecosystem ecosystem services relevant for the study area. And then Then after that, I conducted a key informant interview or expert interview with the chairman of Maharashtra Fishing Cooperation Federation. Maharashtra is the state for which Mumbai is the capital city. And I've done an interview with the chairman of the Fishing Cooperation Federation in Maharashtra, and Dr. Sadasiv Raje, who himself is a fisherman, who is a Kohli, but he's also a scientist from Center for Marine Fisheries Resource in India. Then after that, after analyzing the responses from the interviews, after understanding how the culture works, selected the human dimension indicators for understanding how the deliverance level of these ecosystem services are changing, and a detailed questionnaire are prepared, and most of them were open-ended question. And a socio-ecological survey was done through snowball sampling, and of course done a content analysis. So now the perception of fishers' perception to understand how these ecosystem services delivery has changed in the area due to impacts of climate change as well as environmental degradation. So here you can see the ecosystem service. These are the indicators, and these are the basic perception, the overall perception that we found in the responses of the fishing community. So for example, change in the onset of monsoon or precipitation. Rainfall is unpredictable and erratic. Change in rainfall pattern can be seen through a cultural lens, such as Narli Purnima and Ganesh Puja. So Narli Purnima, Narli in Marathi is known as coconut. So for 3 months of monsoon, they don't go into the sea, they don't do fishing. And after the monsoon, after celebrating Narli Purnima, they set their boat into the sea and they start their fishing journey for the year. And especially also goes for Ganesh Puja as well. It's a quite famous festival there. And they associate these festivals with monsoon, that right after monsoon they celebrate these, but now it has changed that even after Narli Purnima, even after Ganesh Puja, it rains, and the rainfall pattern has changed completely. It has become more erratic. And this affects their fish catch potential as they cannot go into the sea. The fishing days has reduced for them. Then there is change in spawning season, such as change in breeding pattern, and they get mixed catches. Earlier, they would know that in particular season, they would get this fish or this species, or in this area, they will get this species, particular species, but now they get assorted catch instead of one particular species. So there is a change in food wave and other ecological interactions. So I'll just move forward. So these are some of the narratives from the field. Now it even rains after Diwali. So Diwali is another festival which falls in October or November, which is usually winter in India. And I've stayed in Mumbai, so I can say that, yeah, it even rains after Diwali. So if it rains, it's a loss for them. They cannot go into the sea. The fishes will hide away. The various species will hide away, and it's a loss of fishing day for them. I have a brand new net, which is more durable and doesn't get damaged easily. The cost of this net was around 3 lakhs Indian rupees when bought 3 years ago. I have used this net only once. It is no longer useful because fish availability has decreased and we won't get the desired fish. So he bought this net, the fisherman bought this net for a particular species, which was found in my study area. And he could not, he just bought it and it's just lying there with no use because he cannot, it doesn't matter to him because there's no fish available. That particular species is not available. Bombay duck used to breed in June and August, now it breeds in May. So that's another narrative that came up quite frequently in those responses, that yes, the Bombay duck catch seasonality has changed, that earlier they used to found it in June and August, between June and August, now it's in May. For storm and flood regulation, again, there are human dimension indicators and the perception. Okay, so Mumbai is actually made up of 7 islands, so it's basically an estuary. So that's how the flooding problem is. But these 7 islands are actually free from flooding, and those are mostly inhabited by these fishing community. So they don't perceive flooding as a problem because flooding doesn't happen in those specific fishing villages. But in some areas, such as Mahim, the flooding frequency has increased for them. So as cyclone warning has increased, though they haven't faced significant damage from the cyclones, because the west coast of India gets lesser cyclones than east coast of India. Then, as I said, change in number of fishing days due to climatic events. Yes, due to increased number of cyclones and erratic rainfall patterns, there is a decrease in fishing days for them. Then pollution regulation, again, the human dimension indicators and the perception. Here, I would like to focus on the change in observed health of mangroves. So, I have also done a study on the land use, land cover change pattern of mangroves and how these mangroves have, mangrove covers has changed. And and also the mangrove protection cell of Mumbai has done the mangrove cover density change in the area. But so my result as well as the report suggests that mangrove cover has increased in my study area by 15% from 2005 to 2020. But the fishers have completely different perception on that increase. They're completely adamant on their statement that no, there is no mangrove increase, and the mangrove has in fact decreased further. So why there is a difference in opinion from the actual fact? Well, this could be because they are no more allowed to go inside the mangroves, since mangroves are protected areas in Mumbai now. Since they can't go inside the mangrove, they can't spend time there. They have a lot of cultural significance there. They used to use mangroves for, they use mangrove woods for cooking their food, which is a very cultural thing for them. And hence, and it shows that though we can protect an area, we can make policies to preserve an area, but we have to include the community living there. We cannot exclude them. We have to treat them as part of the ecosystem. And so these are some of the narrative that loss of mangrove will be a loss of fishing in the area. It was a beautiful forest, however, it has changed in the last 10 to 20 years. The mangrove forest is completely filled with plastics, completely filled with polluted water. This is just how much percent of responses said which anthropogenic stressors has more impact on fishing. Fishing mostly went for water pollution. Then yes, public health and recreational activities. There was not much loss perceived. For resilience, okay. So for resilience as well, as you can see, most of the indicators indicate that there is a loss of ecosystem services, that deliverance has decreased, and this is one of the most powerful narrative that for others it might not be important. However, we make our home here and our livelihood is dependent on them. And these are some of the pictures from my study area. This is the flooding that happened in my study area, which never used to happen. Let's say past 5 years, it has become a problem. And yeah, thank you. Sorry for taking so much of time.
Sorry to cut you off. I know I have lots of mangrove questions for you for the lunchtime break, but we'll have to move on. Our next speaker is Jacob Eurich, who's going to talk about climate resilience in fishery systems. Thanks, Jacob.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jacob Eurich. I'm a scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, and today I'm going to be talking about pathways for climate resilience in marine fisheries. As it's a Friday, I figured we should start with a bit more of a story. I work in Kiribati. I've worked there for about the last 5 or 6 years. It's a Pacific island nation of about 120,000 people. This island is Butari-Tari, where about 3% of the population live. I was able to spend about a month here learning from the local community. Our research group has been focusing on climate change, coral reef fisheries, and the impact that has on human health, food security, and nutrition. Unfortunately, if you go about 300 kilometers south of Butari-Tari, this is the island of South Tarawa with about 60% of the population, where a lot of the fisheries that we're monitoring in the outer remote reefs are in quite a dramatic decline. So I was really lucky to take this case study to this awesome working group that some of us have maybe heard a little bit about this week. I've bolded those that are here at the conference. The SNAP Climate Resilient Fisheries Working Group started in about 2020 and has been working pretty much iteratively that whole time. We first started with this main question: what key attributes support fisheries resilience to climate change impacts, and how can these attributes be recognized and enhanced in marine fishery systems? So step one, which was co-led by my colleague Julia Mason at EDF, Jackie Lau at James Cook University, and myself in Fish and Fisheries last year, is all about just defining these resilience attributes. We looked at it across 3 different dimensions: the ecological dimension, socio-economic, and governance dimension. Through an iterative review process and a kind of a collaborative working group, we came up with 38 attributes. And we tried to place them in this resilience domain adaptive capacity that we've seen a few times from Josh Sinner's work. So within the 38 attributes in the paper, we just first had to define what resilience was and define all these attributes, which is a little harder than we originally expected. We described how they actually apply in fishery systems, and also looked at how they can confer or limit resilience in these systems. We provide some examples as well. But this was just step one. So step 2 was to build a tool that used these resilience attributes to assess climate resilience in other places. So this tool, the Climate Resilient Fisheries Planning Tool, just launched in January, which we're really excited about. It's meant for fisheries managers, stakeholders, right holders, local communities, scientists, basically you name it. But first we had to actually refine it after we built it. So we started off with these 18 case studies that I'm about to get into, and the 38 attributes that made the entire full process. This tool now is distilled down to 22, to give you an example. And today we're just going to be focusing on one metric of how we kind of think about attributes called the score or strength of an attribute relative to that system. But there's a bunch of different things in the papers that I'm about to present that we're not going to get into today, things like importance and other factors. So jumping in, here's our 18 case studies. We tried our best to kind of span the geographies, but we were obviously limited with our working group members. This is a paper that's in review right now in Fish and Fisheries with my awesome collaborators, Whitney Friedman from Santa Cruz, Kristen Klesner also from UC Santa Barbara, and an awesome PhD student, Lilly, from UC Santa Barbara. So jumping in, here are 30 resilience attributes again, and the 3 dimensions, and these icons will show up a little bit later as well. We're presenting score as kind of our data variable, and as you can see, they're ordered by levels of increasing score. So we're calling the top 3 to 5 attributes within each dimension robust sources of resilience because they all appeared very strong across all of our case studies. You can hone in on the ecological dimension, looking at ecosystem connectivity and larval dispersal, which is obviously directly tied to spatial management. We found that and pulled that out through some of our case studies. But I also want to focus on some of those that dropped a little bit lower. So adult mobility and a target species and fisher mobility are still really important, but they're case dependent. So yes, they could be on average lower, but still in some fisheries, they're very, very important. Similarly, we highlighted attributes that critically need more attention. Things like social and economic diversity, equitable and inclusive governance were on average really low. However, in the paper we described these actually ranked highest in importance. So these are the things where we can put future energy and future research. So flipping the axis a little bit, now the resilience attributes are going to be on the bottom, and we're going to look at how the case studies kind of panned out within this system. So we used a hierarchical cluster analysis to pull together 5 different groups or fishery archetypes as we're describing them. And our goal here was to find common lesson that kind of breaks the bounds of most systems in how we think about fisheries. And what I mean by that is there might be a fin fish associated with a invertebrate fishery or a single species focused with a multi-species. And so when you see that, I want you to think, oh, that's awesome. These are lessons that we can kind of take from different systems that you might not think about. So I'll run through these kind of fast. The first group is the easiest. I figured start with the easy one. Was kind of enabled by all dimensions. That meant that there were moderate to high scores in each one of the 3 dimensions, but specifically one of the reasons why these fisheries clustered together was because of high participation and accountability within the governance sector. Group 4 pulled out within the cluster analysis because the stocks were a little bit more variable than the first group. There's still really strong social processes here and good governance, particularly place attachment, which is a sense of place attached to that location. Social capital and learning capacity were really high. However, here for our 2 Japan fisheries and the Juan Fernandez Island fishery, there was a little bit less mobility and movement between fisheries for fishers, as well as social diversity and economic diversity. The third group and the last one before our major kind of cluster 5, 4, and 3 have higher governance than clusters 2 and 1, had moderate scores for the ecological and governance attributes, but still ecosystem connectivity and larval dispersal, those things tied to spatial management, ranked really high. Getting into my bread and butter, the small-scale fisheries. You see PNG, Fiji, Madagascar, and our Kiribati giant clam fishery. These small-scale coral reef clusters, we found really strong ecological and social processes despite potentially lower economic wealth and resources and infrastructure. And so here, one of the things that we pulled out was high place attachment and social capital. So including that, there were pretty low scores for economic opportunity and mobility. When you think of a coral reef fishery, fishers, on these island atolls are kind of stuck where they're fishing. But there's good ecological things going on because the habitats are quite diverse. So also species diversity with multi-species fisheries is quite good. The last group is group 1, ecologically strong and governance constrained. So this had the lowest governance scores, but we want to focus this doesn't necessarily mean bad governance. It means a lack of coordination between levels of governance. So here we had all of the case studies were kind of constrained by management strategies and the regulatory system, but we found good learning capacity, good knowledge diversity, and pretty good social diversity across all of these. So what do we do with this heat map? We wanted to use, like I said, these 5 fishery clusters to sort of start the process. So as more fisheries are coming in using this tool and filling out some of these attributes, we can sort of start to cluster new fisheries or users that are bringing in new data to fishery clusters that already exist. But what's the next step? So we talked about 2 pathways of resilience in this paper, loosely associated with these large cluster breaks. The first is resilience through economic assets and effective governance. So here that includes the high capacity fisheries, industrial fisheries, commercial, and also market-orientated cash-based economy fisheries. So when you have that, there's a reinforcing feedback loop where more wealth and reserves leads to access to knowledge, and that promotes technology in your fishery. With that, turned wealth into more assets and more economic opportunity, and that drives governance, responsiveness, and innovation further. So in the paper, we sort of dive into different actionable levers that we can take within that feedback loop to build resilience in your system depending on which part of the dimension or which attributes your fishery might be lacking. Similarly, pathway 2, more of the kind of smaller scale fishery group, was resilience through ecological assets and strong communities. So here it was really about ecological assets, the fish stocks and what you're getting from your resources, not being turned into cash as rapidly in the system, but there's still intrinsic capacities, just generically your species are maybe more resilient or the healthy ecosystems are a bit more intact. This can lead to economic diversity and more investments in infrastructure, but one of the major things we took home from this pathway is increasing that place attachment and resilience mindset within the local community, building social capital through things like fishery cooperatives or bringing fishers together, sharing knowledge really helped. So again, in the paper, we sort of dive into some of these levers and action points to build resilience in other pathways and other systems. So as I mentioned, Kiribati settled within that pathway 2, that coral reef small-scale fishery group. Here and across all of the remote islands in Kiribati, we just have an incredible amount of place attachment. Everybody is really excited to learn, so our learning capacity is really high, and there's social agency. You can go into a community and want to talk about fisheries management. Everybody gets really excited, stops what they're doing, and just gets really excited. All of those different socio-economic attributes, as we're calling them, lead to more collective and adaptive governance. So what we saw was community-based fisheries management where local knowledge is being incorporated was actually much more effective on the outer islands than the South Tarawa Island. You remember the one with all the houses that's much more developed, because there those village level boundaries have sort of declined, and it's people have lost their attachment to their specific reefs. So I will add that within the Climate Resilient Fisheries Planning Tool, this is obviously a very data-limited fishery. What we did with our team was we went back and did a participatory workshop. So in our toolkit, we have facilitator guides, some videos, a little bit more information to help you sort of run a workshop if your fishery is data-limited. This included our fisheries officers on the left, who are actually monitoring giant clams in the field right now, fishers on the right, which is really fun to work with. The supply chain actors, which is on the left. Originally, we kind of missed this in our social survey data, but within the participatory workshop, we learned that giant clam are actually critically important for food security. These species are salted, and when motors break down or weather challenges reef-based fisheries, these invertebrate fisheries are really what's going through. Additionally, the fisheries managers that we worked with were at the island scale and also the national level, and all four of those colleagues are co-authors on this paper, and just want to point out that I'm using my voice here today to share their voice. So in conclusion, just a couple take-home messages, since I know it's getting late in the conference. We just want to really stress that resilience is about the natural system, of course, but also the human system. It's not just resilient of what to what, but resilience for whom. Again, this tool is ready. We're so excited. So if anybody's interested, please come and grab any of us. Linked here is like a little way to connect on email, where I can share some of the papers. You can get the websites and that sort of thing. The Fish and Fisheries paper, where we kind of discuss some of the attributes and how the pathways are settled out with the case studies, is just a starting point. 18 fisheries isn't covering the whole globe. So we're really keen to learn from all of you. And I just want to stress, we've heard knowledge co-production and participatory workshops a lot. It's a really good way to engage with communities where there's not as much data. Last but not least, this is just the starting point. We're really excited that this is morphed into a Ocean Decade program called FishCore, led by Kathy Mills and Kristen Kleisner, which both are here. This is kind of a networking group that could be using this tool, but also we're really excited to learn from everybody. So with that, thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to thank just hundreds of collaborators and working group members and everyone that I've been working with in Kiribati to get this where we are. So thank you.
Does anybody have a question for Jacob? You do?
Thank you for this very good talk. Did you look at, under the governance attributes, did you look at the issue of compliance when it comes to, is there any experience on illegal fishing?
Yes.
And how that relates to resilience issues?
Yeah, so we definitely did. We kind of included compliance and enforcement within our equitable and inclusive governance component, so how governance is actually working. But it's also a contextual factor that we looked at. So power dynamics and how compliance and monitoring work within your system is sort of a bigger, broader, overarching component of the system. So it is included in our tool and in the papers that I talked about today. Yeah, very important.
Thanks, Jacob. I think we'll wrap up there for lunch. Don't rush off to a fjord tour or the bar just yet. We have another speaker at 1:30, so we'll see you there. Oh, nobody told me. Please, Greta, come on. I wonder why there were so many people coming in.
How to freak me out. Well, I do feel like a bit of lunch and I'm pretty tired, so maybe we could all pack up and just go. Oh, I was going to start off by saying thank you for hanging around for the last talk of the session. I know we're all pretty tired, me included, and it's really nice to see so many people here that are persevering to the end. I'll start off with acknowledging my co-leadership team here, Karen Alexander, Kirsty Nash, Camilla, who I think might still be, yay, Camilla's here, and Jess Melbourne Thomas, and then there's a whole range of other contributors, some of which are also here as well. So it's a very large interdisciplinary effort. And before I start talking about the Future Seas project specifically, I'll talk a little bit about why we started thinking along these lines. So we developed Future Seas to try and address some of the issues that were underpinning the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences, or at least what we thought we might be able to contribute in terms of that decade. So we all know lots about the decade. I won't go into it too much, but there's a suite of goals and objectives to the decade. And you can see that many of them there, when you dig into these actions, relate to getting more data. So many of those priority areas revolve around getting more data and more knowledge and creating more models. And I think that's absolutely essential. I want to be clear about that. That's great. However, we know that data doesn't equal decisions. People make decisions. And so we really need to try and factor in those human elements a lot more. And then something that drives me insane is that we don't use the data that we've had. And that's not us, you know, we all use the data, but trying to get the people that can make these actions happen, that's not always the kind of uptake that we would like. So that gap between science and policy, you know, if you think in a climate context, that gap of what needs to happen for adaptation and mitigation, that just keeps growing, even though as a community, we're all doing pretty awesome work and developing fantastic knowledge about what's happening and what we need to do. So we started to wonder, what could that future look like if we actually used the knowledge and information that we already have available, not creating anything new, but just using what we've already got. And more importantly, how could we actually get there? So we started thinking about alternative futures for the ocean, thinking about that business as usual future where we're currently headed. I know that's got the downward arrow, but we are making progress in different areas, not suggesting that we're not, but collectively it's not adding up to enough action to turn some of these critical trends around. And then the future where we'd like to go, we started thinking about what's technically possible in terms of a sustainable future, and how far could we push towards achieving those sustainable development goals. So we as a group didn't say we think this is what the future could look like. We were thinking about the sustainable development goals and how far could we push in that direction. And of course the difference between these two futures, and they're only bookends obviously, there's a whole range of things that could happen in between those two extremes, but the differences between those are people, political will, choices, human behaviour, all that kind of stuff. The other reason why we were so interested in thinking about these two futures for challenges like food security and climate change and biodiversity, all those big ticket things, is that as a research centre we focus a lot on the psychology of climate change communication and denial and misinformation and those kinds of things, and we're kind of acutely aware that doom and gloom does not work. It overwhelms people. And then, you know, when you consider optimism, I think that's great, but generally we're kind of not going quickly enough in that direction. And, you know, as somebody that does a lot of communication and engagement around climate change, I feel a bit hypocritical or not genuine kind of doing the optimism thing when that's not where we're going. And so we kind of thought if we can create, you know, robust, scientifically underpinned graphical representations of what the future could look like, we can present both of those things at the same time. Here's where we're headed. Kind of doesn't look great in a lot of circumstances, but here's where we could actually go, and that looks pretty good. So trying to move, you know, I think like we always try and move away from the bad thing rather than here's the good thing, and that actually looks, you know, a lot better. So trying to create positive action in that way. So the challenges that we worked on as a team were things like climate change, food security, what kind of future Indigenous peoples around the world wanted with an all Indigenous-led team, redistribution of species, human health and the oceans, a whole range of interesting topics. There's an entire paper on the methodology behind this project, so I'm giving you the 3-line overview, but there's an entire publication behind that. And there's also a couple of really interesting synthesis papers. So for each of these challenges for the ocean, we've developed those 2 futures, a pathway or a roadmap of actions to achieve those, the more sustainable version of those futures. Then there's a paper on equity that looks at all of those actions across all of those papers and distills what that means for equity in the ocean. And then another one working with a bunch of psychologists and behaviour change people, again looking at all of those actions and going, okay, what needs to happen at an individual and a societal level to really get these things to happen. So an incredibly interdisciplinary team. Most of these disciplines were in each of these paper teams. It was a very challenging effort at times, a bit like herding cats. And there's a couple of people in here, Delphi and Kane, that led one of these challenges and had to manage all these people as early career researchers. So it was certainly a challenging project. We had around 130 people altogether from 12 countries, but collectively we have expertise in around 40 countries or originate from around 40 countries. And we had a 13-member traditional and Indigenous peoples team as well that we invited to come and work with us. And they were people that we knew through IPCC and Species on the Move as a core group, and then they reached out to their networks and invited other participants. So in this project, it was published as a special issue. Each one of these challenge papers was supposed to be short, ended up being quite in-depth, very robust, large papers, but each one of them was an evidence-formed perspective piece with these 2 futures, with graphical descriptions of these 2 futures, and was designed to be that interdisciplinary whole-of-system approach to outlining pathways to sustainable futures. We also designed the whole project to be essentially a training vehicle for helping our early career researchers develop interdisciplinary thinking, skills managing large teams, and really help our early career researchers develop some networks as well. Oh, and I should say, with the Indigenous and Traditional Peoples Working Group that we had, that group came over, developed their own approaches, so they didn't follow the same methodology that I've shown here, and then created their own paper and process. And we also said to that group they could be involved in the other papers whatever way they liked. So some of them were in the core paper teams right from the start. In other challenges, they said, not interested in that one. Another one, they said, we'd actually like to read that, confirm that you haven't said anything stupid. And in another one, they said, or a couple actually, they said, we want to give you this intact piece of knowledge and put it in a box, and we don't want you to touch it or change it. So it was important for whatever that particular piece was that it remained intact and untouched. And so, yeah, they participated whatever way they liked, and I think that was incredibly freeing. So overall, the methodology used an approach called foresighting. So that's a type of scenario development, lots of different types of scenario development now. But this particular approach has been pretty popular in the context of government departments and industry sectors lately. Foresighting uses physical, ecological, socio-economic, political, technological trends to imagine the future. This is just one example of the kind of data that we drew on to develop these futures. And then after you've created those futures, there's a process of backcasting where you go, okay, to achieve that future, what would we need to do? And then lots of iterations around, if these are our actions, is that possible? Going back and looking at the actions, confirming that that's possible. And I think the process is pretty interesting because our goals and indicators at global levels are pretty typically far removed from kind of the actions that need to usually happen. So if you think of 30 by 30, for example, what that needs to actually happen on the ground is, there's a very big disconnect there. And often disaggregating collective action problem into the contributing drivers, so the big trends that are causing that to happen, can really help you identify distinct tasks for specific individuals and actions, and also identify those actions at the right intervention scales where you can clearly assign responsibility and specific routes to impact. So the overall project, and that's the link to the methodology paper, this is the process for the overall project, and the green ones there are what each challenge did. So each individual challenge went through identifying the drivers, creating the futures, and then developing the pathway, and then this iterative process of double checking. The project as a whole, we had quite a nightmarish number of workshops with 100 plus people talking about what are our key challenges and doing surveys and this kind of thing. Also, what was sustainable, how, who should decide, how would we get there, all that kind of stuff. Exploring a whole range of different methodologies and tools. And then another couple of workshops around assumptions. So, things like population growth, what kinds of international agreements could be developed in 10 years, large-scale war, all these kinds of issues. And then that piece at the end that I mentioned about trying to look at equity and behaviour change and the learnings across the whole project. So quite an involved project, but the core bit with those papers is identifying those drivers of change with potential for high impact and high influence on food security, on climate change, on whatever the challenge was, and then that roadmap of actions. And I've got an example here from Delphi Ward and Kane Leighton. And Kane, I did mean to add your picture here and I got distracted in my typical Gretta way, so apologies for that. But Delphi Ward and Kane Leighton co-led the Biodiversity Challenge. And this is just an example of the drivers that were determined to have high impact and high influence on the future for biodiversity. So things like management and governance, financial mechanisms, social impetus for conservation, and sectoral stewardship. And so our actions in the pathway that we developed to achieve the more sustainable future all influenced one of those four drivers. And this is the graphical schematic that I mentioned. So each one of these challenges has different types of graphics illustrating what these two futures could look like. This is the one for the biodiversity challenge. So you can see, the more sustainable future. Obviously, if you look closely, it still actually has a bit of a dip going into 2030 because a lot of the resources that we were drawing upon suggested there's no turning this ship around in the really short term, but longer term we could. And then that business as usual one, grey, bleak, not looking great. And if you look at how these futures were created and the descriptions behind them, the short sort of versions of these drivers go along these lines. So, for the sustainable future, it's integrated ecosystem management of marine ecosystems has been widely implemented. And then, a range of sources that suggest that that's technically feasible. The business as usual future is more, implementation of integrated marine spatial planning has increased, but it's undertaken in approximately only 30% of EEZs. So there's, each driver draws upon a whole lot of information to collectively describe and create these futures. And then there's that roadmap for action for each one of those drivers and the challenges. And that suggests, what's the action for each driver or actions, the time frame, the actors, who needs to do that. There's spatial scales and also often who benefits. I'll show you this is, an example of the graphic for the food security paper. This is the kind of thing we've got for the climate change one, toxic algal blooms and industrial fishing on this side, and then more integrated multi-trophic aquaculture and, other things on the other side. This is what the Indigenous paper looks like, and if you read anything, I'd really encourage you to have a look at this particular paper. It's been downloaded a heap of times off the resource of the journal. So they used their own methodology, and we had people from all sorts of places around the world. I'll finish up just by describing how we communicated the results of this massive project to our local community in Australia. And so this activity was designed as a public communication activity where we engaged an art performance crew. They read all the papers and picked out what each of those futures would look like and feel like. Nothing to do with the data. And they described this science action thriller that is shown online in 2 futures. So it's about hijacking on the high seas. There's no part of it that's like, this is sustainable, this isn't, climate change, do this, do that, or anything like that. It's just a fictional story, but told through the business as usual future and then the more sustainable future. So it flips constantly throughout this whole thing, and it's, you know, one orange-coloured screen around the business as usual, and then a blue-coloured screen around when it's showing the more sustainable. And so, you know, in one, it's like a monoculture facility. In another one, it's a multi-trophic artificial coral reef facility. One, they're using, you know, Black Hawk helicopters and boats that leave diesel slicks on the ground. And in the other one, they're solar-powered dinghies. And we use this for public communication, but it was open to anyone. And we had a lot of our industry leaders watch it, and I started panicking, thinking, oh God, they're going to think I'm a left-wing, you know, they're not going to fund anything I do ever again. But we got lots of emails saying, that was a fantastic way of communicating to a lay audience why this stuff matters, how good the future could look. So we're investigating these kinds of approaches in more depth. But to finish up, I think it was a really useful project for helping ECRs and all of us, actually, everyone in the team, thinking about how we could have impact. Where does our work fit? The graphical abstracts, I think, were really useful for helping all of us think about communication skills. It's generated so many different spin-off projects and ideas. We all learnt more about working with other disciplines and across different knowledge systems. We've, you know, really enhanced our networks, and I think it has really expanded our perceptions of the problem and the solution space. And we have plans now to try and extend this into like a public version of what kind of future do you want, or like a regional downscaled kind of version. So I think there's lots of possibilities for this kind of approach to engage more people and hopefully get more interest in action. And I've gone 3 minutes and 40 seconds over time. So thank you very much for your patience. Apologies.
Thank you, Greta, and sorry for trying to kick everyone out before you gave your presentation. It was certainly worth staying for. We actually have plenty of time for questions because we'll keep going until 1. So who has questions for Greta?
I was wondering, as you're thinking about the visualization of these futures, how you think about maybe contrast and what that would look like in a short-term context, like say 2050, where maybe we've got a lot of economic growth and we haven't quite gotten the bad things yet. And how, when you're working with those artists or thinking about things, how do you deal with short-term versus long-term consequences?
Yeah, most of these futures were by 2030. That's all right. No. Well, I showed the biodiversity one, which was the one that actually went along much longer, because when we developed these futures, we kind of went, 2030 is not really enough time to show a huge difference collectively at a large scale. But the other ones are, more all presented at 2030. And again, we know from lots of people's research that managers and government need to know kind of things that are in their planning horizon at least, and that although we need to keep 2050 and 2100 in mind, that they kind of feel more empowered and more impelled to do things if there's that more achievable timeline in mind. Yes, that's a great question.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. My name is Oliver. I'm a PhD student from Laval University, Canada. I work with indigenous people at the north of Quebec City.
Yeah.
I have one question for you, which can help me to my study. How can we today better integrate indigenous people for the sustainable management of our marine ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a huge question and there's no blanket answer to that. So it's, you know, we've worked with many different groups and they will all say something different about what is the most appropriate way for that group. We try and work more in Indigenous-led ways if we can, like Kane and I have worked on a project where the community came to us and said, we're worried about this, can you help? That's the ideal situation. But yeah, I think it's, the basics are obviously trust and respect and developing a relationship, and there's no shortcuts there. It takes time, and we were reflecting on this project earlier, and I think one of the key reasons why it worked in this context was because we had a 5-year working relationship with the core members of that Indigenous and Traditional Peoples Working Group over multiple projects, where there'd been consistency in that communication and you know, proper chance for us to develop that trust. So yeah, no shortcuts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I'm looking forward to reading a bunch of those papers that you put up on the slides. I was thinking about how in one of the earlier slides you had political will as a major contribution to the gap between science and policy. And I can't help thinking about, for a lot of the sustainable futures that people are envisioning, they require shifting power dynamics, and for people who are currently in power to lose that power. And so I'm just wondering, like, how that came up across case studies, and if there was a way that you found to communicate that to policymakers who are the ones currently in power.
Yeah, another question I'd love to know the answer to. I don't know if it's naive or not, but I do think that young people are really not going to put up with the situation that we've landed with them. And I know, like, personally, I get a lot of hope out of the student protests that happen around the world. I think it will actually reach a point, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years where there's no option but for politics to change. People will, you know, see extreme event after extreme event after extreme event and you know, hopefully get motivated to change something. You know, we called it political will, but really there's, you know, big systemic problems with large-scale industries that kind of pull a lot of the political strings. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is, and but I think they were tackled in that behaviour change paper. I can't remember the details of what was said though. Can I just quickly ask Delphi, Kane, Camilla, Janet, have I missed anyone, to stand up, because there's yeah, lots of these people were like really involved in the project as well, so worth Delphi. Sorry. So worth chatting to for if you've got other questions as well.
Are there more questions? Oh, yeah.
Thank you, I will be fast. So I was just wondering, you mentioned the behavioral change aspect, and if you could just pick one behavioral change that could enable the equitable ocean futures that we in this room could contribute to, that is tangible. I know it's a very difficult question, but if you could just pick one.
I would probably say stewardship. I think that's something that we can all foster and encourage, and if people are more connected to their local systems, they can see local change and benefits. Making sure that the things that you're trying to get local people to do have some kind of tangible action. Like, one thing that we never try and do is communicate and then go, here's your problem, and walk out. You have to leave people feeling like they're empowered and they've got something constructive that they can do, even if that's only a small part of the solution. But the whole behaviour change thing is a massive challenge and something that, you know, I think, personally, I think would be a really valuable area of research for how do we get people to connect more strongly to future states, and how do we get society collectively to kind of want to work together to something that's more positive and, you know, visually compelling.
Did you have a question here?
Yes, thank you, Prof, for this very good work. I was going to ask what will be your perspective with regards to the future for countries, particularly who look at fisheries as a source of income. I mean, keep on fishing and fishing. You know, they think they need some money from fisheries. At the same time, the issue of sustainability is there, and how. Yeah. What is your experience with the Future Seas project with regards to sustainability and the economic, especially countries with economics in transition that depends on fish resources as a source of income for economic development?
Yeah, I think food security has got to trump everything pretty much. Like if you're in a country, you know, where you need fisheries resources for food and livelihoods, then that's incredibly important, and it will be a lot easier for more developed, higher income countries to be making transitions. And I personally think that there should be, you know, we talk a lot about loss and damages. Western countries have created this problem in no uncertain terms, and it will be other countries that are left to suffer the consequences. So, you know, I think there's a pretty compelling argument for subsidies there for nations that, you know, won't have options.
Are there any more questions for Gretta or any of our other speakers?
Might be questions for some other speakers.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gretta.
No worries. Thanks.
We have a couple of minutes. I actually had a question for some of our other speakers. I felt like there was a lot of presentations about the development of social indicators and a lot of work put in that area. So I think there was Louise and Jacob and Padmanav. I think a lot about how I can package those social indicators to be usable by managers in the same way that ecological indicators would be used. And I wondered if you had perspectives on that. Somebody stick their hand up. Where's Louise? Or Jacob? There you are.
I don't think there's like a good answer for that. Yeah, I think what we wanted to explore was actually within EcoAce is to take those social indicators to district municipalities and municipalities and kind of have some interaction with them on what they would need. Because I think there's a problem in what we think people need to make decisions in government especially, and what they really need. There seems to be a very big disconnect to me. So that's something that we're quite interested in exploring, and to kind of develop or use some of those insights to inform our thinking of how to proceed with it and whatever tools. I think somebody Lynn mentioned the Green Book as well this morning in her talk in another session, and that we've come to the space where we've got these online tools that are now available that also uses other indicators in South Africa, and I guess the trick is now to how do we kind of package all that. And for me, I think the key is in capacitating decision makers. And at the same time, the caveat is that we speak a lot about capacitating communities for decision making, but we're not speaking enough about how do we capacitate decision makers for decision making, or how do we, they're not necessarily trained in all these things that we think are obvious. And we all go to the communities and, oh, we must do it at the small scale, it's all nice and vogue and yay. Because those is where we see the real impacts, but we're forgetting about having the same conversations within the governance structures to kind of go, okay, fine, what do you need to learn and how do we deal, what is it that you need to be able to make these decisions that we want you to be making? So I think in our context, that certainly is a problem and where we'd like to work a bit more. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely, that's something that will stay with me. How do we capacitize decision makers for decision making? That's a great statement. Does anybody else have any comments on that? Nobody behind me? Maybe just one big question then before we head to lunch. What have we learned today about how to manage equitably across all of these presentations? What are the key things that stick out? What have we learned? Nobody learned anything?
Today I think that according to all presentation, I think that we have to take account indigenous knowledge and also teach for young people who will be the future generation the importance of climate change or the world sustainably, world ocean sustainably. Thank you.
Thank you. Were there any other comments? Yeah?
I think we probably may have to look at doing things differently. What I learned is that the world is quite exposed to climate change, and with regards to resources, particularly economic resources, fisheries resources for the oceans. So we may have to, the take home perhaps would be to do things differently and to be able to do trade-off where we may want to deviate a little bit from business as usual. What that means is that, for example, for countries that are suffering a lot from climate change impact, like Professor Gretta mentioned, they are emitting very little greenhouse gases. So maybe developed nations around the world may want to consider the issue of loss and damage to be able to see how they can help these countries to develop their adaptive capacities with time. And there is also the opportunity of trading carbon, which these developing countries that are affected much from climate change impact may want to look at. Can we trade the carbon footprint from, for example, mangroves? Some countries are highly inclined in mangrove forests. When I attended the COP27 climate change conference in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, the issue of loss and damage came up, but also the other benefit of these countries that are suffering, where they can trade their carbon footprints from mangrove forests, for example, is now an emerging issue. So that means we may want to deviate from business as usual to take some of these things on board. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a good sentiment to finish this session today and go on to lunch. So thank you so much, everyone who attended or presented. We had a really productive session, so let's just have a final round of applause for all of our speakers.